Great. Awesome. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the Dakhleh Oasis project's
It's
new series.
just start. Yeah.
We're starting now, indeed. So welcome to the second webinar of the Dakhleh Oasis project's new series, From the Sands of the Sahara, the Archaeology of Egypt's Dakhleh Oasis. My name is Jorge Coelho de Jesus. I am MA Egyptology from the University of Manchester, and I'm very happy to be back to moderate today's webinar. In the wings, we have, of course, the wonderful Pavel Polkowski, the director of the DOP, who will be is and will continue to be the backbone of this webinar. So please note, as you've just heard, the webinar is indeed being recorded. Now, I suspect that all of you know what the DOP is, but to those who might be new, the Dakhleh Oasis project is an important initiative that has been carrying out research in Egypt's Western Desert since 1978. Its various constituent projects undertake vital archaeological and interdisciplinary work
That's it.
on a vast timescale of Egyptian, wider Mediterranean, and African history. The work covers a wide range of areas, from archaeology, Egyptology, and classics to anthropology, zoology, geophysics, and as we'll see today, of course, bioarchaeology. The interdisciplinary approach is at the heart of the DOP and will be a central point of today's webinar. Now, the purpose of the DOP's webinar series is twofold. First and foremost, it seeks to present to the wider public fascinating information about the discoveries that have been made over the years in the Dakhleh Oasis and about life in the oasis. And secondly, and as you may have heard, the webinar series is connected to our crowdfunding campaign, so towards a better future. In the past, the DOP has relied on participating expeditions for its operation. However, with no fieldwork being allowed in recent years, as we all know, the DOP has unfortunately become solely reliant on private resources. This means that over 40 years of research and promising studies are at risk due to rising costs. In the face of this situation, the proceeds from this webinar series will go directly towards the crowdfunding campaign, which will support the maintenance of the DOP's dig house and the publication of research. Now, we will put the link to the campaign in the chat during the webinar, so feel free to, of course, take a look at the crowdfunding campaign and to share with your contacts. Now, moving on to today's main event, which isn't me speaking, it's in fact our webinar, Life and Death in the Dakhleh Oasis, the Bioarchaeology of the Peoples of Ancient Kellis, by Dr. Tosha Dupras and Dr. Peter Sheldrick. Now, Dr. Tosha Dupras is Dean of Texas Tech University's College of Arts and Sciences, a role she's held since June 2022. She's been a member of the Dakhleh Oasis project since 1996, and her primary research focus has been the reconstruction of life history, diet, migration, disease, growth, and development through the analysis of stable isotopes and paleopathology. Dr. Peter Sheldrick is a retired family doctor in Chatham, Ontario, Canada. He has been a member of the Dakhleh Oasis project since 1979, so a very, 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 very long time, working there practically every expedition season.
Take it easy, 79 wasn't that long ago.
Yeah,
That's fair enough. So he helps with the excavation and analysis of the human remains, with a particular interest in paleopathology, the study of disease in ancient mankind. Both Tosh and Peter, of course, co-direct the bioarchaeology team of the DOP. And indeed, I stand corrected, of course, in the grand timescale of Egyptology, 1979 isn't really that that long ago. So before we get to the webinar, just a few very quick housekeeping rules before we commence. So the lecture will last approximately 45 minutes, after which time we will have a Q&A session. Now, the way we'll run the Q&A session is if you have any questions, please add them to the chat. I will then read the questions and say, of course, who the question was from. And of course, then the relevant presenter will reply to the questions. Please do keep your microphone and video off during the presentation so that there is no interference with the presentation. For those social media savvy of you, do feel free to tweet and post on Facebook and Twitter about the webinar. The more buzz we can create around this, the better. Our Twitter handle is @EgyptDOP, for example. And so now this last point I've been asked to change. I've been asked to say, and I completely agree, that you approach this webinar as you would a concert. When you're at a concert, you really need to sort of enjoy it, be in the moment. So I would ask, refrain from taking photos or screenshots of the content you are here, which means that you will afterwards be sent a recording of this webinar. So do just enjoy the moment. And so without further ado, that's enough from me. Tosha and Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. And I'm just going to attempt to share my screen and hopefully. All right, can everybody see the presentation fully? Okay, great, thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, first, Pavel and George, for inviting Peter and I to speak today. Peter has asked me to sort of present a lot of the overall material, and he's going to kind of chime in here and there with specific facts about certain things that we have found. But we're very thankful for all of you today joining us. And as George mentioned, I've been part of the project since 1996. I joined as a PhD student and then just never left. And of course, Peter took me under his wings and taught me everything that he knew about the Oasis. And of course, has been a vital part of our team as we've met every year in the Oasis, and then for all of our analysis and publication. So I did want to make mention, and of course, let's see here. Okay, I did want to make mention that we will, of course, because we are a bioarchaeology team who study the human remains from the Dakhleh Oasis, that we will be presenting images that show human remains. And just Peter, can you give me a thumbs up or thumb down? Did it advance to the next slide? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay. So probably as most of you know, the Dakhleh Oasis is located in the western desert of Egypt, and it's a part of a series of 5 oases. And here on the map to the left, you can see the location of the oasis in relation to the Nile and also to Cairo and the Delta. And actually for our work, we will be touching a little bit on this geography, because one of the aims of our work has also been to understand where the people of the Dakhleh Oasis came from originally and where they were moving and migrating to. And we're going to mention a little bit about that. So it gives you a little bit of an idea about the distance between Dakhleh and the Nile, and also the Delta and the Mediterranean. For us, that's very important. We know that there were caravan routes throughout the Western Desert, and people moved on those quite regularly. And that helps to inform us where these people came from, and also regarding how they lived and how they died in the oasis. So archaeological evidence does show us that people inhabited the oasis as far back as 200,000 years. But we do believe that the zenith of the population probably did occur during the Roman and then into the Christian period. And what we do know from all the archaeological survey that has happened as a result of the Dakhleh Oasis project, that there were many towns and villages throughout the oasis during this time period. And I do want to make note here, thanking Colin Hope for images of the actual settlement of Kellis that we're going to use for the next couple of slides. So throughout the oasis, one of those settlements was the ancient settlement of Kellis. And excavations since the early 1980s have shown us that Kellis was an important administrative area or center of the Dakhleh Oasis. And archaeological excavations also show us that materials dated the habitation of this particular site to the first 4 centuries AD. We do have many ideas about why this particular area might have been abandoned, but it was clear, and you can see from the images, that at one point in time it was abandoned. So here you see in this particular image a sandstone temple located in the center, many administrative buildings, houses, etc. Let me see here. So you can see here administrative buildings, early Christian churches have been identified. And then also there are a series, and we'll mention this again, but there are a series of tombs located actually right on the periphery of the ancient settlement. We also, of course, are highlighting here that even though we know that the settlement was abandoned at some point, so what we have sort of left over is the materials that people left behind. But I think that these images here definitely show the wonderful preservation of the ancient site of Kellis, and that also extends into the cemetery sites that we're going to talk about. And I'll mention here that among the houses, we have discovered important artifacts that really have led us to a greater understanding of life in Kellis. So here, for example, as in the other slides, we see garbage or debitage that was left behind by the inhabitants when they left the village. And one of those things that we find is illustrated in the images here, particularly in the right-hand upper image, there was the discovery of 2 wooden codices. One is a child's school book, basically with a rendition of the Isocrates text, and the other one has been described as a tax document or account book from the estate in Kellis, documenting sort of all the goods that were coming in and out of this particular estate. There are also many finds of ostraca or pottery with written documents on them, and also papyrus that have been found that also give us a glimpse into how people were living in the village. And I mentioned specifically the codices, partially because of my work in stable isotope analyses. Having an understanding of some of these goods going in and out of the ancient village of Kellis helps us to interpret what sorts of goods or foods these individuals may have had access to, and how they would have ranked those particular items in terms of luxury items or everyday items. Now, as we mentioned, there are a series of tomb structures that flank the ancient village of Kellis, but there are also 2 larger cemeteries that are associated with the settlement of Kellis. One here that we're not going to talk a lot about today, but is the Kellis 1 cemetery. And this is located to the west of the village and contains a series of rock-cut tombs. And individuals buried in these tombs were thought to be from the late Ptolemaic, early Roman period. And as you might see from some of the images here, that some of these individuals, we think, were intentionally mummified. So it looks like the practice of treating the dead and mummifying the dead did actually kind of go up into the Roman or early Roman period, Ptolemaic period. And as you can see here, which is something that we as bioarchaeologists encounter throughout the Dakhleh Oasis, is many of these sites have been disturbed. So what you're seeing here is basically the result of looting. Now, the focus of today's talk is really going to be on the discoveries that we as a bioarchaeology team has made, centered on our excavations and analysis of human remains from the Kellis II cemetery, which lies east of the ancient settlement of Kellis. Now, the Kellis II cemetery has been, let's see here, has been really sort of the intense focus of the bioarchaeological team since 1992. The Dakhleh Oasis team has focused on really what we would consider a multidisciplinary approach, bringing together many avenues of information to allow us to reconstruct the lives and also the deaths of these particular individuals. And so today we're going to really present to you a glimpse of what we've discovered about the people of ancient Kellis. And to kind of mention, we have had a core team of bioarchaeologists that throughout the past 30 years have really joined us, including Dr. El Malto, who was sort of the founding individual of our team, and Dr. Lana Williams and Dr. Sandra Wheeler, and myself and Peter, who have remained the core. And we have had many, many students join us over the years and have also gone on to do their master's and PhD dissertation research on the materials. So we have a very, very rich, I think, bibliography of materials that have come out around the Dakhleh Oasis and around specifically the bioarchaeology of Kellis. So I should preface by saying that while Peter and I are presenting today, this really is about the accumulation of all the work of all these people who have participated as part of our team. So while the archaeological survey over the years of the Kellis II cemetery has revealed upwards of approximately what we believe, based on density, of about 4,000 burials located in the Kellis II cemetery, so far to date, we have excavated 767 individuals. And that was up until basically our last season, around 2012. And of course, after the revolution, we have not as a team had permission, with the exception of a very short stint that Peter had in 2018, I believe, right, Peter? Yeah.
2019, January 2019, that's the last time we excavated. That's right.
Yeah, so we've had very limited access to excavating and have had some opportunity to continue some of those studies of the material. Now, one of the things that you'll notice by one of our earlier maps that I'm showing here of our excavations is that individuals are buried in an east-west orientation, aligned with the rising sun or solar alignment. The slight variation in angle that you can see on this map shows that individuals were buried during different times of the year, according to where the sun was on the horizon during that particular part of the year. And we have had some work done on this by Dr. Lana Williams, who actually correlated her isotope findings to solar alignment to show us when specifically people were eating certain kinds of food, allowing us to sort of see during what times of year people were actually dying in potentially greater numbers. And most of the burials, as you can see here from the image on the right upper side, are simple rectangular burials. And in most cases, they are single interments. On a few occasions, we've had some double interments. And some of those individuals, as you can see in the outline here, are buried in tomb or mausoleum-like structures, but the majority of the individuals are not. So they're in single rectangular burials. So as you can see from these images, this just sort of gives an overview or a snapshot of some of the ways in which individuals are buried in the cemetery. We do have some archaeological evidence for the fact that probably most single burials had some sort of a superstructure over top of them that may have been coated with a white plaster. But mostly that's deflated on the desert floor. So we don't have a lot of evidence for that any longer. However, you can see here that we see many substructures in our graves that are majoritively built out of mud brick. Some individuals have pottery placed over them. Other individuals have nothing but potentially a burial shroud, as we see here. So we do see a sort of a variety of mortuary styles. But one of the things that we can see is that we are seeing a reflection more and more of a Christian ideology in terms of the burial style. Now, as with the images that I did show of the settlement of Kellis, where we have very good preservation of materials, we also see very, very good preservation in the Kellis too cemetery. So in addition to our preservation, which actually is very helpful to us as bioarchaeologists, we do see that everybody, regardless of age or potential pathological affliction during their life, were buried in the cemetery. And this is a departure from what we see in earlier burial practices in ancient Egypt, where in some cases you have very young fetuses or infants being buried in different locations, or children being buried in different locations than adults are buried. But here we see everybody being buried together. So here we see an example of an individual with an A-frame substructure. That is the middle upper photograph, covered also in rosemary and wrapped in a more Roman style crisscross textile bands. We think that this individual may represent one of the earlier individuals buried in the cemetery, where we still see a glimpse of that Roman tradition melding with the introduction then of Christianity in terms of burial ideology. Now, just sort of a brief overview of those individuals that we've actually analyzed. So this image shows actually the analysis of 725 individuals. And the pie graphs are meant to sort of show the distribution of those individuals who are adult skeletally and are either show skeletal signs of being adult male or adult female. And then, of course, 63%, or a very large percentage of our population, are children or non-adults. And this includes fetal individuals, children through various age, through adolescence, until they're deemed skeletally adult. And then the lower chart shows sort of an age distribution of all of those individuals. And one of the things that you might notice is the very large number of individuals, or percentage of individuals, who are actually of fetal into infant or below 1 year of age. So 25% of our population. And then between 1 and 4, that's another 14%. That's a very large percentage of our population together. And when you look at this, what you can surmise is that if you made it past probably 5 years of age, you probably had a much better chance of surviving in this society. And we think that infants and children, young children, probably died very quickly of a lot of acute diseases that we would not see happening today. And Peter and I have had many conversations about this sort of affliction. And Peter, you might want to make some comments about what we might think that children were dying from.
Yes, well, most likely from infectious diseases for which we immunize today, and we take them for granted. Polio, diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, various types of pneumonia, and probably gastroenteritis caused by contaminated food or water because of sanitary conditions that aren't what they are today. I find an interesting study, just as a sidebar here, that probably tetanus was more common than we think. Today, we give no thought to tetanus because the tetanus toxoid vaccine is the best we have. It's practically 100% effective. However, in ancient times, particularly because animals and farmyard animals are in such close contact with living quarters, there's probably a lot of manure around, and animal manure is filled with the germ, the spores of the germ that causes tetanus. And all it would take is a skin that's contaminated with that, plus a deep penetrating wound, and it's tetanus. We know that the ancient Egyptians were aware of tetanus. In fact, the Edwin Smith papyrus, I think it's number 7 case, shows the treatment of tetanus. Anyways, I digress. Back to you, Tosha.
Thanks, Peter. So one of the things, the way that Peter and I are going to kind of tackle this next part of our talk is to kind of look at the life cycle and some of the stories and histories that we've learned about individuals at different phases of the life cycle. So just starting, basically just starting with what we know about birth in ancient Egypt. There's not a whole lot that we do know, but we can surmise some things actually from what we've been finding. So even though we don't know a whole lot, the skeletal remains can give a little bit of a glimpse into the very difficult process of birth. We see here, for example, this particular remains of this individual, which are very well preserved. That this individual died very shortly after birth. And the reason why we do know that is because we can see here the cord that was used to tie off the umbilical cord. We also have examples that represent adult women and infants who most likely died during the process of childbirth. Here we see on the left-hand side, the remains of an adult female. Those are her lower legs that are on the left-hand side of the photo. And then we have a newborn infant that was buried right before or beside her legs. In the other photo, which may be a little bit harder to see here, we do have an adult female buried with actually a fetus buried between her legs here. Now I use the word buried, but in fact, we think that this might represent what is known in bioarchaeological literature as a coffin birth, where a woman may have died during the process of birth, but because of being buried, and then during the process of decomposition, the fetus is then expelled. And you can see that here. This is just to give you an idea of where the skull is. So you can see that the skull is coming out the direction towards the knees. We also have one example of what we think are twins. These are 2 individuals that were buried together and wrapped in the same linen textile. The tissue is preserved enough to indicate that these would most likely have been fraternal twins, one a female, one a male. And this, of course, are considered even in modern terms as being a more high-risk pregnancy because they're multiples. Now, we also have a lot of different examples of what we would today call birth trauma, indicating that many women had difficulty giving birth. We think most likely due to small obstetric dimensions, which one of my graduate students has done some research on. Now, these include things like fractured clavicles, which you see healed fractures here in A and B, fractured humeri, damage to the shoulder, and also fractured vertebra and fractured ribs. Now, these all potentially are birth traumas related to a condition such as shoulder dystocia, where shoulders get stuck behind the pubic bone during delivery. Also breech births, and also rough delivery techniques such as pulling the baby out by the arm. And what this does tell us, though, is that, and we see indications of this in ancient literature, that there may and must have been sort of a midwife system to assist in difficult delivery. Now, in addition to what we've just been talking about, and I mentioned earlier that we are very confident that everybody is included in the cemetery, regardless of their pathological affliction. Here we actually show congenital birth defects. One example here on the left side is a condition that we have differentially diagnosed as osteogenesis imperfecta, or brittle bone disease, which is caused by a genetic condition that doesn't allow for normal collagen production. So the bones are very brittle, and the individual fetus tends to have fractures actually in utero when they're born and afterwards. And the bones grow bent, as you see where I've indicated here with an arrow. And a lot of times these individuals do not survive very long. We have other examples of congenital birth defects, such as anencephaly, where the individuals, the top of their skull and brain do not develop properly. The top right here shows a normal development of a frontal bone, and here's what we see in anencephaly juxtapositioned with that. Anencephaly is also another neural tube defect where you do have a abnormal development of the occipital bone, or the back, the bone of the back of the skull, and also the cervical vertebra. And we have a couple cases of that also. And I did not put what these infants look like when they're born, but they look very different than a normal infant. And this is one of the reasons why we think these individuals everybody was buried, because they're not always recognizable like you would have as a normal infant. I want to mention, as we sort of go into childhood, that a lot of times there are no skeletal indicators as to why these young individuals die. The congenital defects, we know why those individuals died, but in a lot of these infants and children, we do not. On rare occasions, we do see indicators of why these individuals may have died in childhood. So we do have examples of trauma throughout the skeleton and throughout the cemetery in different ages. But we have two examples, for example, of severe fractures in children. This image showing on the bottom a young child of about 12 years old who had multiple fractures throughout their ribs, their vertebra, their pelvis, and their legs. And when we compare this to modern clinical forensic literature, these are the type of injuries that you see sustained in individuals who have sustained what we call high velocity accidents, like a car crash. Now, we know that they weren't, having those types of high speeds in vehicles, or probably even horses at that time. But this individual could have fallen from a high elevation, like from the escarpment, or, for example, had a house collapse on them. And Peter and I have talked about the fact that this is even something that still happens today in the Oasis. So we do see some of those types of trauma. And I'll also mention briefly that we have one very interesting case of a young individual of approximately 3 years of age that has also severe trauma throughout the body, indicating fractures, fresh fractures, healed fractures, new bone formation in response to trauma. And so when we look at this and we compare this individual again to modern clinical forensic literature, it looks very much like we would describe as today as child abuse. The location of these fractures, such as those in the humerus that you see pointed to by the arrows, and the clavicle, are typical injuries that you would see in shaken baby syndrome. Now, I'll mention also that because we're looking at the whole of the individual in the burial, and we have very good preservation of hair and hairstyles, etc. I will mention that so far, when we're considering pathology and vectors of pathology, that while in the Kellis 1 cemetery, where we do have a lot of evidence for certain kinds of parasites, we don't have a lot of that in Kellis 2, particularly because we don't have the preservation of certain organs. But we do have preservation of certain parasites like this, as you see here, fleas. Now, there's a lot of discussion in ancient Egyptian literature about lice, but we actually haven't found any of those yet in Kellis 2. But we do know that potentially they could have been and carried different kinds of pathological diseases with them. Now, we also have skeletal indicators in this population that shows that they were under stress. We may not know exactly what kind of stress, but their skeleton was responding to stress. For example, we do have potential cases of rickets, as you see here, which is indicating a lack of vitamin D. Now, we get our vitamin D from sunshine. We know there's a lot of sunshine in the actual oasis, but we also know that individuals who spend a lot of time indoors, who are swaddled, who wear complete clothing, may not get a lot of vitamin D. And we definitely have some indicators that that might have been the case in the oasis for some children. We have some indicators of possibly scurvy or not getting enough vitamin C. Other indicators of a pathology that we call cribororbitalia, which is those little fine dots that you see in the upper eyelids, indicating some kind of anemia. Now, we have anemia for all sorts of things: iron deficiency, malaria. We can't really pinpoint the cause, but we know that they were fighting against something. Also, things like osteoarthritis that you see here, and in most cases, a normal aging process. However, we do see a lot of this in the spinal columns and a lot in the knees of our individuals, which have been studied by some of our graduate students, indicating that their occupation may have also been contributing to what we see in their skeleton. So if we know that Kellis probably was very dependent on farming, and we see a lot of occupational changes in the skeleton due to farming and other occupations, like, for example, weaving. Now, probably for all of you who have been to the Oasis, it shouldn't be a surprise that people dealt with dental issues. And I've experienced that many times, biting into food and bread, for example, that has grit and rocks in it. And this is something that throughout Egypt we see commonly. All bioarchaeologists talk about this in all the populations that they look at. So one of the hazards of living in a desert environment is the dental implications of what that means. So when you eat a lot of grit in your food, it wears down your teeth. It's easier to introduce pathogens into your mouth. We see examples of dental caries, some very severe examples, as you see here in the bottom right hand, of abscessing, and that's because pathogens are being introduced through those worn teeth or the cavities on the teeth. Eventually resulting in, for individuals who live to an older age, resulting in almost complete odontoless individuals. And we have several of those individuals. On some occasions, we get plaque buildup on the teeth or dental calculus, as you see here. But this is not uncommon in terms of if you live past 35 in Dakhleh, in the ancient village of Kellis, you would have had some dental changes, worn teeth, loss of teeth, etc. We'll also mention here that we do have indicators, skeletal indicators of infectious disease that do include several examples of leprosy and also tuberculosis. I want to pause here and talk a little bit about the work of Dr. Amanda Groff, who did specifically look at the stable isotopes of individuals, some of those being individuals afflicted with leprosy, to look at the oxygen isotope to see how individuals were moving around Egypt. And one of the very significant finds that she made was definitely that using stable isotope analysis, she could indicate that many of the individuals that had leprosy actually started their life in the Nile and ended up coming to Dakhleh Oasis later in their life. We do have a lot of hypotheses about why this might be. I think I've got that on the next slide. Yes. And it has to do with the fact that individuals living in the Dakhleh Oasis were accessing the artesian water coming up, and up until we moved into the new house in Dakhleh, we would, as a team, regularly go and bathe in these artesian wells. And those are artesian wells, we do know, are full of the mineral, the water is full of the mineral alum. And alum actually is a mineral that is used to treat leprosy. It's used to treat the sores of leprosy and give individuals with leprosy relief. And so while some people have surmised that these individuals with leprosy might have been banished out to Dakhleh, we actually think that they may have been coming to actually seek treatment and be exposed to the artesian waters. So I think this was a really significant find for us in terms of looking at how people were moving from the Nile Valley to the oasis. So Peter, we're gonna talk a little bit about evidence of cancers. I'll mention here very briefly that we have other genetic skeletal changes indicated by things like brachydactyly or shortening of the fingers. But I'll turn it over to you, Peter, to talk a little bit about cancer.
Okay, thanks, Tosha. I think at this point we could pause and just realize that the Kellis II Cemetery has produced one of the largest and best preserved collection of skeletons from ancient Egypt. And this opinion is shared by other scholars, not just ourselves. And as such, it lends itself to statistical analyses that can be compared with modern data. And so in the over 700 skeletons that we have studied so far, only 2 showed signs of cancer involving bone. One was a child about 3 to 5 years of age who probably died of leukemia. And the other is this woman seen on the right-hand side. She was about 35 years old, who probably died of cancer of the uterine cervix. The picture here shows the metastatic spread of her cancer. That's not just bone breakage. The bones were very well preserved, and those are the lesions. That's what it looks like when bone is eroded by cancer. Now, our colleague, El Molto, is much better at statistics than I am, and he has been able to show convincingly in an important, well-received paper, actually, that cancer was much less common in Kellis than it is in modern times, even taking into account the fact that we tend to live longer now and other factors. So if cancer is more common today than it was then, it should lead us to the question, why? So we think this is just another aspect of the value of bioarchaeological research. I mean, archaeology is intrinsically interesting, but it can also and should also offer lessons about who we are in the present and even in the future. So as an example, why is cancer more common now than it was in the past, now that we can prove it? Thanks, Tosha. I'll let you carry on.
Thanks, Peter. So one of the other things that Peter and I wanted to mention is that, and this is actually something that we still see today in the modern population, And some of you who were there may have been working with some of our colleagues there who have suffered from this. But one of the things, and all of us that go there have to adapt to this, is that when you're there, because of the actual arid environment, it's very easy to suffer from chronic dehydration. And because of this, one of the things that we do find in some of the skeletal remains of these individuals are kidney stones that are still preserved. You can see here on the upper right photograph, this is actually a kidney stone that is cut in half, and you can sort of see the accumulation of the mineral over time in the kidney stone. And I'll point then to the photograph on the left and this large stone mass that I want to point out here. This is just not a stone artifact that was put in with the burial. This, in fact, is a large kidney stone. And I think I have this here. Yeah. And here. Okay. And this particular type of a kidney stone is called a staghorn kidney stone. And this is where mineralization fills the urine collecting part of the kidney. And so this would be really a massive one. And Peter, do you want to comment on the pain level here, since you have dealt with people in the Oasis that have kidney stones?
Well, I have actually, and it's quite true. I talked to a urologist in the Oasis, and he pulled out of a drawer several of these kidney stones, which he's removed by operating on people. So it still happens, and you're quite right. Dehydration causes a concentration of the urine such that the mineral kind of deposits or precipitates into the collecting part of the kidney called the pelvis, for those who are familiar with kidney anatomy. So it continues to be a problem today.
Yeah. So we know that this is a long-standing problem from people who have occupied the Oasis. And we also know, much like modern populations, many older adults also suffered from diseases related to their diet, such as arteriosclerosis or thickening and hardening of the arteries. And this image here, let's see here, actually shows part of that mineralization or hardening of the arteries that would have been resting on the vertebra. And is this the aortic, Peter?
That's correct. Yes. It looks like eggshell, but it's actually the remnants of the mineral of the calcified mineral lining the aorta.
And I want to sort of end talking about the life cycle here, where you saw the sort of distribution of the age chart, and we do have people in the ancient settlement of Kellis who did live into their 60s, but it's a very, very small portion of our population. And I think, Peter, you're going to tell us most of those are women, right? Mostly female in that category. So Peter, did you want to talk a little bit about these slides here?
Well, yes, this shows an example of a fractured hip. Now, once again, some statistics are interesting. You can see in the middle picture there, that's not a normal femur. There's a separation between the head of the femur and the shaft of the femur. So this person died shortly after she fell and fractured her hip. Now, I don't like statistics either, but we do have about 42 women who are at age of 50 years or over, all presumably postmenopausal. And of these, 7 have osteoporotic hip fractures similar to what we see here. That is a prevalence of 17%, which is exactly the prevalence of this problem in modern populations.
So we're finding those sort of similarities between the ancient population and modern is very fascinating, and we know that they would have been had a disability, not being able to walk. They would have had to have caregivers with these particular types of ailments.
Yes, quite right. In fact, we got several examples. And we could go further and say that when we look closely at these bone fragments, or the fragments of between the broken pieces, they were trying to walk on it. With the two bone pieces will rub together and kind of form a shiny surface, indicating that some of these women were actually attempting to walk. You can survive a fractured hip without modern surgical treatment, but it's rare. Most women are confined to bed, especially the older women who are confined to bed, and they usually die of pneumonia or pulmonary embolism, blood clots, and that sort of thing. We do have a couple of examples of fractured hip in younger people, and they have healed. The bone pieces have knitted together, and they were able to walk, albeit with a limp perhaps afterwards. So some treatment was applied. Some knowledge seems to have been there to help people survive some of these very serious injuries.
Thank you, Peter. So this sort of, just to kind of wrap up our obligatory sunset photo from Dakhleh. You know, our ultimate aim of the bioarchaeology team really is to reconstruct the life of the individuals of the inhabitants of ancient Kellis, to give us an idea both at the individual level, but also at the population level of how these people lived and died. And, you know, we really can only imagine that Kellis was a vibrant and thriving and active settlement, with children laughing and playing in the streets while their parents faced the daily struggles for survival, fighting and combating illness, and also resulting in death, as we see here. So Peter and I just want to thank all of you very much for allowing us to share part of the story today. And I also just really want to take a quick moment to thank all of those who have supported our work throughout the years. It's been decades now that we've been working on this project. And special thanks to Lana Williams and Sandra Wheeler and Colin Hope for providing a lot of the material that we are showing today. And also all the students over the years who have participated and added valuable information to our understanding of how people lived there. And also, of course, thanks again to Pavel and George for having us present today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tosha and Peter, for what was a fascinating presentation. A lot of really great insights and food for thought. I think a perfect reflection of the importance of the interdisciplinary approach to archaeology and Egyptology. And as was mentioned, the importance of this work to understand not only society as it was then, but now as well, and the insights it can provide us also for the future. So thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Moving on to questions. So this is the Q&A session is now open. If you have any questions now, please do add them to the chat and I will read them out. I'll also read out, of course, who they are from. We'll give about 10 minutes or so to this Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please do add them to the chat. Maybe in the meantime, while we wait for people to write them down, if they have any, I could launch the Q&A session with the first question. Could you maybe talk us through a little bit the techniques that have been utilized in the analysis of the skeletal remains at Kellis 2?
So you can start a bit. You want to go ahead, Peter?
No, I was going to say that's for you.
Okay, that's for me. So the analysis that we're able to do has really been dictated a lot by whether or not we had access to remove remains for further study. And up until a certain point, we did have permission by then what was the SCA to do further analyses on human remains outside of Egypt. But what we do in country really is sort of the analyses of how old the individual was, how tall they were, how old they were when they died, are they male, are they female, And then also doing our study of paleopathology. Is there any pathological signs? Is there trauma, for example, any indicators of how this individual may have lived or how did they actually die? Now, when we're able to do other types of studies, that's where we look at stable isotope analysis, which has to be done in a very specific kind of lab setting. We've also done DNA analysis on some of these remains to look at family lineage within the cemetery and also the relationship between Kellis 1 individuals and also Kellis 2. So was there a family, did these families survive throughout all the centuries in between in Kellis, for example? So, those are the types of things we use. And then of course we bring in all the other types of information, the archaeological information that we've learned from Colin and Jill and their team on, different sorts of artifacts that they have found and uncovered. Really do help us inform maybe our pathological diagnoses, for example. Work that Rufus Churcher did for many years about the animals that were available there to help inform our dietary analyses, and also pathological, as Peter just mentioned, where are different pathogens coming from. So, we've really relied on that, the whole DOP coming together to give that information for us to analyze the skeletal remains.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. Yes, that's as you put it at the beginning, it does take a village to carry out this kind of work. We have a question from our very own Pavel Polkovsky. Have you recognized any traces of violence on any skeletons, such as caused by a fight?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We have very little signs of interpersonal trauma in the cemetery. And correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but I think we have one indication of somebody who was stabbed, correct?
Yeah.
But that looks like a dagger stab wound in the vertebral column.
Yes, that's correct. There's actually two ribs next to each other that have very fresh slices that were obviously made by a very sharp knife, a double-sided knife, a dagger. And there's no sign of healing. That person probably died of that stab wound to his lungs. We have a few other. We have the occasional boxer fracture. Now,
pugilistic.
Pugilists are taught to punch with these two knuckles, but if you miss and you hit with the fifth knuckle, that will often break that fifth metacarpal, the metacarpal in your hand next to the small finger, and almost nothing else will cause that but a punch.
Yeah, and other than that, we don't really see any typical defensive wounds that we might see. So it's more sort of different kinds of trauma that we see, but it is a very interesting observation that we have very little of that.
Well, I might add, you just reminded me of one of the Perry fracture. This is a fracture of the ulna, which is caused by someone trying to avoid being hit by putting the forearm up. And that also produces a fairly distinct type of fracture. We have a couple of examples of that. But as you say, this is probably a fairly peaceful population.
Great. We have another question from Rhiannon Williams. Has the isotope analysis revealed individuals from outside of Egypt?
As of yet, no. Well, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult because sometimes there are isotopic signals that may be found in other places of the world that are similar to the Nile. But what we can say definitively is this person was an immigrant to the Oasis. And so we do our best to sort of chart where they may have come from based on their isotopes, but there is some limitation to that. But there are, using both a combination of oxygen and nitrogen together, we have been able to be relatively, I'd say fairly confident that the majority of the individuals are coming from the Nile. Yeah, but there is a chance they could have come from farther abroad.
So this is the sort of then the type of analysis that you would use to determine that those individuals with leprosy came from the Nile Valley as opposed to being from the oasis themselves.
Exactly. And the way that we do that is by comparing the isotope analysis of the individual's teeth, which are formed when they are children, to those that are in their skeleton, which are formed later on in their life. And what we have seen is that, you know, for those particular individuals, their dental isotope analysis indicate that they were not born in the oasis. So, and we have a very good record now of what the isotopes look like of those people who were born. So you can definitely see differences in that.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Good. I'm happy to see how lively the chat is today. Excellent. Another question from Alexandra Warwick. Have you noticed any patterns with whom the individuals are buried close with, for example, male-female segregation or separation of subadults and adults?
So thank you for that question. I actually had a master's student who did her work, an Egyptian student, Hiba, who used GIS to map our cemetery and to look. She did all sorts of pattern analysis. And one of those analyses was, you know, are children buried in relationship to adults? You know, do we find certain clusters? And what we kind of found was that there are kind of clusters of where people are buried in the cemetery. We think, and Peter and I have talked a lot about this, that we think we can see where they actually had roads in the cemetery to bring people, to bury people. People seem to be kind of clustered in certain areas. There seems to be people clustered right around tomb structures where we have made some hypotheses that these are family tomb structures, and then, you know, you can only fit so many people in a tomb, so you start building people or burying people outside of that. But the actual placement of infants and males and females, it seems that infants are sort of buried wherever they could fit them in between adults. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be any male-female subadult pattern to that. But thank you for that question, because that's one thing that we've been very curious about. And we haven't been able to do enough DNA analysis to take that to the next step. And Peter, did I miss anything on that?
No, I think you're quite right. We have been able to El Molto, for example, who does non-metric variation, but looking at small variations, genetic variations on skeletons, has been able to show pretty good evidence that the people that are clustered, as you say, are related. Yeah. Genetic variations in their skeletons.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to end off with two very quick questions from me, seeing as I think the chat has calmed down a little bit, and then some final announcements, and then we can end our webinar today. So my next question. So I just had a pure curiosity. Where are the remains that have been analyzed so far stored? Are they stored in a facility in the oasis? Have they been brought back to the valley? Where are they stored?
They're stored in it's called a storage museum, but it's basically a storeroom. It's a very large storeroom, heavily secured actually by the local authorities of the SCA. All of the bones and mummies are well labeled. The bones are in metal boxes, well curated, so that they actually form, I think, a very important reference population that lends itself to future study. Eventually, when more techniques and better techniques, new techniques are developed, we can revisit all of these individuals and study them with the new techniques. So I think it's an important collection, and I'm very happy that the antiquities authorities are storing them for us.
And it's what, Peter, it's a couple miles from the site of Kellis, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, a very short trip.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very good. And my last question, so you mentioned that there are approximately 4,000 burials, more or less, in Kellis too, which is a lot, of course. And of course, we know it's been a while since excavations in the area have been permitted. So are there any concerns surrounding the state of preservation of the cemetery that might affect future sort of discovery and analysis?
Well,
Yeah.
the site is very well guarded 24 hours a day. And however, they can't look at everything. But fortunately, if you just look at the terrain, you wouldn't even know there was a cemetery there, fortunately. And as long as we don't find any gold, people aren't going to be rummaging around in that cemetery, we hope. We always are very worried about any kind of rumors that there's something valuable there. But frankly, there's nothing valuable enough for people to loot in that cemetery.
Yeah. And I will mention that, while we're focusing on the human part of that, one of the things that we do race against is time. And every year we have the Humsine winds go in there and the desert becomes more and more deflated. So as you actually walk through a lot of the cemetery, we do think that a lot of it is already gone. And that's simply because it's been deflated over time. And the skeletal remains themselves become exposed, and then after they're exposed to the sun, it doesn't take very long for the sun, the wind, to completely denigrate the skeleton, and it just disappears. It turns to dust. And so my very first photograph that was on the slide presentation actually showed that. It's a skull kind of coming up out of the sand, and that's the result of the deflation. So that was one of the reasons why we're really intent to get as much information as we can, because eventually probably most of that cemetery will disappear.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you once again for the fascinating presentation. Okay, I can give. Okay, there's one last very final question that just I'll allow this very final. No, that's very good. The very good. One final question: what are the DOP's hypotheses? Okay, two final questions. Jesus. Okay, I'll allow these two. That's it. First question, what are the DOP's hypotheses for abandonment by Rhiannon Williams? And Alexandra Warwick asks, who would I better, who should she contact about further information on the bioarchaeology of the Dakhleh Oasis? So hypothesis for abandonment and who to contact for the bioarchaeology. Go.
Well, I definitely have my own personal hypothesis based on isotope analysis. And one of the hypotheses that I personally hold is salination of the fields. Because essentially, as we bring water up from the aquifer to water the fields, they become saturated in salt and plants can no longer tolerate and they don't grow. And in fact, if you go to the oasis in, now, you will actually see salinated crops. And it's just a layer of salt on the top. And so there has to be very specific efforts to basically rejuvenate that soil for growth. And so when you have a community that is so reliant on agriculture for its food and its animals' food, the more you do that, and you get farther and farther away from your actual settlement in terms of where you can actually farm. So we do see some isotopic evidence for that in plants that we've looked at. And so that's one of my hypotheses, but there could be many other reasons why. And I don't know, Peter, if you want to add to that.
No, I certainly agree. Other people will suggest it's because the water supply dried up, because we do have a couple of spring mounds, or at least wells, deep wells in the area, and they just seem to be completely dried up. If you want to read more about it, I could put a plug for this book. I'm not sure if that shows. Kellis, a period village in Egypt, Egypt's Dakhleh Oasis. It's edited by Colin Hope and Jill Bowen. And chapter 16 is written by Colin Hope and Jill, and it's called The Abandonment of Kellis. So all of those theories are talked about in that.
Yeah. And please feel free to reach out to Peter and I. I'm happy. I'm the sort of the curator of all of our publications, so I'm happy to share Dropbox links with all of the dissertations and theses and all of our publications in there. And I think I'm going to be sharing some of that with you too, George, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Indeed, we'll be sending around a sort of further reading list after as a follow-up to this presentation to all those who attended. So thank you very, very much for this great presentation. It was fascinating. The chat was abuzz with activity, so I think that's a brilliant sign. So thank you, Tosha and Peter, for this excellent presentation. A few very quick then sort of final announcements for the DOP. Do keep in mind there will be more webinars throughout the year, so keep an eye on our social media, on Facebook and Twitter for more information about the next webinars series. As I mentioned, we will be sending around an email later on with the first of all the recording of this presentation, and also with a list of further readings. So for anybody who wants to read up more on what they've heard on today. And I also want to plug in a book, or to plug a book that the most recent addition to the DOP's lovely collection by our very own Pavel Polkowski, Rocks in Motion, Dakhleh Oasis, Petroglyphs in the Context of Paths, Roads, and Mobilities, that has very recently been published and is available to purchase. I think we will share, Pavel, in the chat. You can share the link, and we can also share it in the follow-up email for anybody who is interested in the petroglyphic work. So yes, I think that's it for our webinar today. Thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you soon for the next one.